Okay, so welcome everybody here first thing in the morning, and I'm very grateful to be here. I work quite a lot at the policy level on peace building, trying to work with governments and civil society and governments from both conflict countries and the North in thinking about and trying to change policy and practices towards having just really more sustainable, just approaches to peace building and state building in countries that are emerging from conflict and fragility. And I do a lot of work with the UN and also teach at the New School in New York. So I'm going to give just a quick, a race through some thematic areas and looking at what are some of the conflict trends, and then some of the most important, as I see it, indications or entry points for transformative change and peace building that I'm hoping, humanistic psychologists and others can see as important streams within the area of peace building and transformative change to link into. So sadly, we start off here with a picture of Syria just to recognize and honor this, what is taking place around the world in many countries. Honor the people, that is, and the extreme devastation that war brings. So some of the trends in conflict, violence, and fragility, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about these words as well, and what we mean by them. But conflicts are really changing. Many people, when they think of conflict, they're thinking of conflicts between states, and that's pretty much almost a thing of the past, right? So in the last 15 years, we've only had about one conflict, interstate conflict, taking place. Many more are occurring within countries, civil wars and so forth. But there has been a spike in conflicts. It was going down. There was some excitement, but then over the last, last 8, 9, 10 years, we've been seeing it starting to go up again. And this part of it is because countries tend to go back to war. There's this notion of war reversion, which means we're not getting it right? I mean, the peace efforts are not really working because, as you can see, 90% of the countries where there was a civil war ended in the past 30 years went back into conflict. And wars are internationalizing, right? So even though there was this, everyone said, well, civil wars, everything's civil, but now we're seeing them spread across countries, right? Which of course makes them much more difficult and much more intractable when you have a lot of other actors involved. They're just much messier to try to address. Everybody's politics are involved, and it's very difficult to have more organic bottom-up resolutions. So we are also seeing a huge proliferation of undisciplined armed groups, both at the national level and transnationally. War used to be kind of easier to at least bring people together and try to resolve because you just had two parties and you had kind of a known structure for dealing with it. There was rules of the game, right? And that's it's dissolving, because there's so many different types of actors with weapons that are, engaging and mixing and merging of conflict and crime, and again, which makes it much more difficult to kind of figure out what exactly are the causes and how then to address them. It's also, many more women and children are involved, much more child soldiers. Where in World War I, it was, I think, 5% of the casualties were not combatants, and today it's about 90%. Rise in violent extremism. I mean, we could talk about this for 5 days, right? It's an important issue. And here's just one startling statistic. The number of countries with more than 50 deaths from terrorism in a year rose from 15 in 2012 to 24 in 2013, and I know it's just rising. And we might think we're divorced from this, but we know that's not true. It's happening here. Both, we're victims of it, and it's also growing in our own soils. When I returned, I lived in Zimbabwe for 4 years, and I thought, I did my book, I wrote a book on polarization and transformation in Zimbabwe, And I got home and I just thought, we are as polarized as, you know, the political parties in Zimbabwe and as the societies. It was a shocking realization in terms of our political party system and how polarized and destructive the discourses and practices too. So this notion of fragility, here is a picture of Haiti. I took it before the earthquake. This is a river. That's garbage. That's plastic. So I'm kind of going, yeah, this notion of fragility has become a big, not new concept, but an increasingly used concept. And it's really about the inability of a state to do what a state is supposed to do, to govern its territory, to provide services. And we're seeing fragility as a huge, you know, quite rampant phenomenon. And a lot of states don't like to be defined and categorized on these lists of, you know, fragile states. But the truth is, and we're seeing it, that even in the United States and in other parts of the world, you know, in Northern Europe and beyond, you know, we have states of fragility, pockets of fragility, ungoverned areas, right? So this notion of fragility is very powerful, and it interacts a lot with conflict and violence, right? So where you have fragility, you tend to have more propensity for violent conflict and also just for violence and crime. Consequences, again, trying to understand what's the cause. Sometimes the consequences become the causes, right? The notion of migration and displacement, that is such an enormous issue today, and not just in Europe. You know, all the focus is on Europe, but if you look at the numbers, it's worse in Northern Africa, Lebanon, other places. The numbers of refugees they're holding, and you know, that's a potential hotbed for new wars and of course new forms of fragility. Fragility, yeah, okay, let me move on. So here's another picture I took in Liberia. These guys are trying to mine diamonds and illegally, but it's also in their communities, and you know, they want to feed their children, and they think that these diamonds are in their community, so why can't they mine them? The UN, this was basically right after the Civil War, and nobody had anything and there were no jobs, so important issue.
Who's resisting that?
Who's resisting that?
Them
Well, natural resources are often on sanction after a civil war because you know, they can also be used. Of course, in Liberia, they were used to fuel war, right? So gold and timber in particular, so there was sanctions placed by the international community to try to help the country get back on its feet and create laws and systems and governance practices so they could effectively manage their resources, right? So that it's not being exploited and used for simply for warfare. So it's a process, but it's a very difficult one, very, very complicated. I can say more about it afterwards. Okay, so let's move to the positive side. What's the good that's happening, and what are the opportunities for transformative change and peace building? And I know we all define these terms in different ways, but and I can say more about that later, so I'm just going to keep going. My focus, I do a lot more work on the area of peace building at the international level, and you know, these are some of the key themes that are taking place that really excite me. So there's a lot, you know, I've been interested in how do you sustain peace forever, but it's become important again in terms of the United Nations, partly because of that war reversion notion, right? So if countries keep going back into war, how do we make sure that they sustain peace, right? And this means a lot more emphasis, finally, you know, on less this notion of negative peace, how do you just stop the violence, and how, versus positive peace, how do you build lasting structures and cultures and mindsets of peace that are going to really sustain and build an organic, nationally owned peace. And the notion of prevention's come back around again. But this is always a very sticky one because governments do not like to have other governments in their hair, especially investigating what looks like, you know, a problem and telling them how to resolve it, right? So there's a sovereignty issue, which is has been a main challenge for prevention, and also this question of causality. How do you actually prove that it's going to become violent? You know, it's very difficult to prove that you prevented a conflict. Context awareness and conflict sensitivity, and I know this is, you know, important for at least context awareness for humanistic psychologists, which is wonderful. Studying more, understanding more what, you know, what occurs and why in a particular context. And within the international peace building community, this has become much more important, finally, over the last 10 years especially, because we failed at imposing kind of liberal, templated, top-down, Western-driven approaches to trying to help countries recover from war. And it didn't work. It's not working, which is not a big surprise, right? So now there's a shift, like, well, okay, how do we really understand what's going on inside the country and build and support those endogenous capacities? Conflict sensitivity is a really important concept, which is being taken up increasingly. It's been around for a while. Maybe you've heard of the notion of do no harm, right? This is something very dear to my heart, and I do a lot of it. You know, how do we understand the drivers of conflict within a particular society, and use that as a lens to then ensure that any other area of work, what be it security sector or law or governance or development, is not exacerbating those conflict drivers and actually trying to do better, you know, to contribute to peace, right? But you have to understand the context better. You know, you have to understand what the corrupt sources of, you know, of institutions are, and the relationships, the political economic relationships, so that you can, when you're encouraging programming or policies or institutional development, it's not just reinforcing those drivers. And in the social services, I've done some of that too, around peace, around education and health with the UN. So if anyone's interested, there's a nice report on that. Inclusive processes, forging robust social contracts. Hooray, like inclusion is becoming, you know, there's evidence, you know, wow, great. So there's a lot of like frenzy around the notion of inclusion at the intergovernmental level and within the UN, and reports coming out on it, and evidence being illustrated finally. And it's connected also to that sustaining bit, and the fact that war, 1 minute? Okay. The fact that war, you know, these kind of elite level political agreements and peace agreements don't sustain unless they are really truly, you know, more inclusive and rooted in greater and greater inclusivity and building social contracts, right? So this notion, it's a challenge, and this is something I'm doing a major research project on. How do we move from these political settlements and peace agreements, which are fairly elite, how can they be more inclusive and move towards really more robust social contracts that engage and build society as a whole, and how to do that when people have really a lot of competing allegiances, right? And some of them transnational violence and so forth. So how do we, you know, I'm afraid we, you know, it's a good question. Do we have to keep this state, and how can we keep this state in order to have robust social contracts? It's one of the most challenging questions. Resilience, another big area that humanistic psychology is interested in. It's a, you know, something, it's a concept that's, and a, you know, a body of thinking and practice that's really amazing, because it's cutting across all disciplines. And within the peace building field, it's really about systems approach, about, again, focusing on the endogenous sources of what is driving you know, more positive elements within society. How do we get endogenously, you know, how do we have local actors define and design their peace? And I think it's a challenge for humanistic psychologists in particular to think more, because my impression is that it's very individual focused, have to think more and to do more research in the area of social, you know, the interactions within at the communal level and between communities and nationally, because this is what the peace building field is interested in, right? And needs to incorporate more of. And lastly, you know, there's this the new development agenda. So in the last 15 years, we had the Millennium Development Goals, the Millennium Agenda, and now we have the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, and it's called Agenda 2030. It has the word transforming in it, which is wonderful, and it for the first time, it has peace and inclusive societies and focus on justice and security within the development agenda. And this is something I've been working on with many other thousands of people for years. And so it's a big achievement that that's in there, and we have a lot of work to do to make it meaningful and to realize how it can become more grounded in realities. So I'll stop there and talk more. Thank you.